Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalam wa barakatullahi ta'ala wa rahmatuhu ala Sayyidil Mursaleen Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'een. Subhanaka la ilma lana illa ma 'allamtana innaka anta alimul hakim wa la hawla wa la quwwata illa billahil aliyyil azim. Allahumma salli wa sallim ala Sayyidina Muhammadin salatan ترضيك وترضيه وتنتوي بها أعمالنا ونياتنا وحركاتنا وسكناتنا فيه. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا تأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. اللهم إنا نسألك العلم اللدني والمشرب الصافي الهني يا وهاب يا غني. اللهم إنا نسألك العلم اللدني والمشرب الصافي الهني يا وهاب يا غني. اللهم إنا نسألك العلم اللدني والمشرب الصافي الهني يا وهاب يا غني. Alhamdulillah. In our discussions on the Mukhtasar of Imam al-Quduri alayhi rahmatullahi ta'ala, may Allah allow us to benefit from him and his great works. We've been discussing within the chapter of purification a few different topics, and we mentioned in the previous class, right, the issues related to menstruation and postnatal bleeding and irregular bleeding. So, today is the final chapter of purification, where we discuss impurities, or filth, you can say. We mentioned in the very beginning that there are two types of impurity generally that is recognized by Sharia. Right? So in the Sharia, that which is considered impurity is that which the Sharia deems to be impure. So it's not merely like a person can have spaghetti sauce on their shirt, right? But that's not considered impurity or filth, right? We're talking about a specific thing that the Sharia deems to be unworthy of a person praying with that thing, right? Or on their clothes, or on their place of prayer, or on their body. Right? So this filth, this impurity is either ritual impurity, which is like a state that a person is in, an impure state, so that is removed by either wudu or ghusl, or if there's no water, then tayammum as an alternative. So we covered all three of those. The second type is physical physical impurity, right? And najasa al-haqiqiyya, right? Actual najasa or physical impurities. So the final chapter discusses the different types of physical impurity, how to remove it, what is excused of it, and what exactly is impure. Right? So we'll just use the term filth because it differentiates between the state and the an actual thing itself. Right? And then we'll just have an opening to the chapter of prayer, right? Just to remind ourselves of the realities before we go into the rulings. Fiqh itself, it's not the job of fiqh or Islamic law to discuss inward realities or spiritual aspects of the worships. Right? It is only there to delineate what is the rulings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala involved. Right? So it's important to remind us as we go through the different chapters and the different sections, to remind us of those realities, because we were not created only to follow rules. Right? But there is no way to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala except through following His limits. But it's a worship of the heart, more first and foremost. Right? The manifestation on the actions, right, in application of the Sharia is only a tabi' of that quality. It's only a secondary consideration of that inward reality with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Both are important. But many students get caught up in the outward rulings and forget the inward realities. So it's good to have both. So Imam al-Quduri alayhi rahmatullahi ta'ala, he mentions that تطهير النجاسة واجب من بدن المصلي وثوبه والمكان الذي يصلي عليه. That it is obligatory to remove impurities or remove filth from the body, the clothing, right, the body of the person engaged in the prayer, right, the clothing, and the place where that prayer is occurring. Right? And what he means by obligatory, it's obligatory for the prayer. Right? And we'll talk about in a second that there is also a sense of obligation, even if it's not for the prayer, like to keep oneself in a state of purity outwardly and inwardly is most definitely one of the recommendations of the Sharia, right? And to leave filth on the body without any need to do so, right, is seen to be contradictory to that, right? And we'll mention the ruling later. Right, so the body, the clothing, and the place of prayer. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, وَثِيَابَكَ فَطَهِّرْ, right, and your clothing, purify it. So the scholars of commentary of Quran, the exegesis of the Quran, they mentioned that if Allah is commanding the Prophet to purify his clothing when engaged in the prayer, right, then the body would be even more of preference. The body will be even more of preference because the clothes can be changed, right? And if it's important to do that, which is just something that you wear, then what about yourself? Right? And the place of the prayer would also be indicative of that ruling as well, because those verses are related, right, in the context of prayer. Right? وَرَبَّكَ فَكَبِّرْ, and your Lord then glorify, meaning Allahu Akbar in the prayer. And so we find this ruling found in the Quran. So the filth must be removed from the body, the clothing, and the place of prayer. In other texts, you'll see that they arrange the text in a different way. Well, they'll tell you these are all the conditions of the prayer. Right? And amongst the conditions, you'll have, right, removing any ritual impurity, right, and any physical impurity from the body, clothing, or the place of prayer. So those are, right, prerequisites to the prayer. A friend of mine in school, we were trying to study for a test on this in a couple, I think the earlier years, right, and he made up this interesting thing to do to memorize. So he said that the conditions of the prayer are intention, clean body, clean clothes, cover your awrah, right, the clean place of prayer, face the qibla, and the time must be right because the sun is on. So it's a full circle. Whatever helps the student memorize. The student comes up with amazing things right before the test. I used to try to memorize all the names of the author and the dates, their birth date, the year that they died, and the year that they were born, by means of abjad, by the huruf al-hijaiyah. There's a counting system by letters in Arabic. Abjad, hawaz, hatti, kaliman, sa'fas. So I would memorize it like that. Whatever tricks you can use to memorize. So the default product that you will use to remove impurity is water. That's it. Right? And Allah says, وَأَنزَلْنَا مِنَ السَّمَاءِ مَاءً طَهُورًا, and we sent down from the heavens or the sky purifying water. So water has a natural quality of purifying something else, right? So it's pure and it purifies other things, regardless of an intention, as we mentioned before. Right? However, the basis, that's the consideration that is made, is only on whether the impurity remains or not. If it's removed, it's removed. Whatever means you do to remove it, it's removed. Right? So technically, you can use any liquid substance to remove the impurity. Any liquid, right, that is pure itself, because you don't want to use impure water to clean yourself. It's kind of, it's counterproductive. And it must be able to remove. So it has to have the quality of flowing, because the water, it takes the impurity and flows and takes it away by flowing away from it. So if you were to use, for instance, right, some grade A Canadian syrup to remove impurity from your hand, right, it's not going to do it because it's not flowing. It's going to be very slow, and right, if you used honey, it wouldn't do it. It wouldn't. But if you used, for instance, rose water or lemonade or vinegar, right, or even like hand sanitizer or any of these things, right? If you, in the end, you look at your hand, the filth is gone, not a single trace, right? So, right, the basis and the consideration is on whether the actual impurity is gone or not. It's not what you use necessarily. Right, so you can use anything. You can even use used water. Used water, is that what you made wudu with already? Right? So used water is pure, right? But you can't remove ritual impurity with it. You can't make another wudu, but you can remove physical impurity with it. And so that's important. In other schools, you have to use water. Right? So if you had blood on your hand, right, in the Shafi'i school, and you use vinegar to remove it, right, you might not see it anymore, but it's still considered impure until you actually run regular water over it. Right? And this issue comes up if somebody has blood in their mouth, right, or has some sort of impurity in their mouth, then if right, the relied upon position is even if you swish your saliva around and spit it out, your mouth is pure. Right? Because it's removed. It goes with the saliva, because saliva is a liquid that has a flowing nature to it. Right? But according to a secondary opinion, that you have to actually use water and rinse your mouth out. So that's not the mu'tamad though. But so you can literally use anything. So if you have like blood on your hand, you can take some saliva and remove it. Right? Just don't use the same finger twice, because then you'll be licking the impurity. So in essence, anything can be used. Some books, they actually detail out, like the Hidiyah al-Alaiya and a few different books, they detail out all of the methods that you can use to remove impurity. Right? These are the 5 basic ones. There is one more actually, tanning. Tanning is not mentioned here. We did talk about tanning before. Right? So tanning removes the impurity from the hide of an animal. It removes that wetness, which is impure, right? And in the end it becomes dry. So the effects of that impurity is gone. Right, so washing is the default. Right, so washing you're going to use to remove any visible or non-visible impurities. Right. But there are other criteria as well. So we'll talk about each one of them as we go. So rubbing, right, having to do with the shoes, rubbing it on the ground, right, scratching, right, wiping, right, and transformation. The last one has a lot of modern applications. So washing is straightforward. We'll talk about that in a minute. So rubbing, Imam Quduri, he says, إذا أصابت الخف نجاسة لها جرم فجفت فدلكه بالأرض جاز. Right? If impurity that has a body to it, right? It's not liquid, it has a body to it, comes in contact with your khuf, with your shoes, right? or leather sock, right? Right? فجفت, and then it dries. Right? And then the person rubs it on the ground, on the dirt, right? Then it's pure. Right? Jaza meaning طهرة يصح للتطهير. Right? It's pure. The Prophet ﷺ said, إذا وطي أحدكم الأذى بخفيه فطهورهما التراب. فطهورهما التراب. If any of you steps on impurities with their shoes, right, then the purification of those 2 shoes is the dirt. Is the dirt meaning just rub the shoe onto the dirt. Right, but this is to the extent that the traces are no longer there. And you look down, it's gone. Right, it's gone. Right, so the details in Mukhtasar al-Quduri are quite brief on this. He just mentions that just like that. But we find in other texts really good details to clarify the matter. Right, so this applies to solid filth, or so something that actually has a body to it. Right, and it also applies to liquid filth that has attained a type of body because it mixed with the dirt. Right, so if you stepped, for instance, in a puddle of urine or some urine, right, with your shoe, and then you rubbed it on the dirt, the urine mixes with the dirt, and now it has a body. And then continue to rub, and then it's just like if it were solid in the beginning. However, if it's just pure liquid filth, and and it doesn't mix with sand or dirt or anything to have some sort of body, then you have to wash it. You have to wash it. Or you can just step in some dirt and then go back to the square one. Not square one, the mall, but just go back. And then once you keep wiping and it goes away, then it's good. And it is pure. So a big portion of this chapter is for taysir, facilitation, to make things easy. And so we find that there is a constant effort from the Prophet and from the lawgiver, from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right, to remove any undue difficulties in these matters. Right? So what remains is just the general burden of responsibility. We also find in the ahadith that's the idea of removing dried impurities by scratching it away, or just yahukku, right? Just to scrape it away, scraping or scratching it away. I say that Aisha narrates that she would actually use her fingernail to scrape away any dried semen from the clothing of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And that's purity. That's purity, because the actual essence is gone, and once it's gone, we consider it to be pure, because it's not like a matter of philosophy that whether it's pure or not. Is it there? No, it's gone. It's pure. Right, so if it is not dried, then it has to be washed with water. But once it dries, it can be scratched away or scraped away. Right, the basis is it's not there anymore. It's removed, and that's sufficient. Right, so Imam al-Quduri, he says, وَالْمَنِيُّ نَجِسٌ, that semen is impure. Right, now, this is, right, sometimes they'll mention very subtle lines that are indications to a difference of opinion in other schools. So according to Imam Shafi'i, the semen itself is pure. Right, and his proof is a good proof. Right? It's an amazing scholar. And he mentioned that Allah says, وَلَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي Adam, that we have certainly ennobled the child of Adam. Right? And that child of Adam is created from that. So to ennoble it, it's part of its ennoblement is that it's pure. Right? However, that is not the opinion in the Hanafi school, because Allah says, ma'in maheen, right? A despicable liquid. Right? And there's many different verses of the Quran, right, that would indicate. Plus, if it was pure, she wouldn't scratch it off. Say that Aisha, she wouldn't have to scratch it off. Radiyallahu anha wa ardaha. Right? So it is impure, and it does need to be removed. And now this also applies to the body, that if it's on the body or on the clothing, it can be removed by scraping it away if it's dried. So, this next one has great modern implications and can be a big concession for a lot of people, especially people who have children, right? Young children. Then the matters of purification become very important to know if a person has children. Right, so if there's any surface, well, let's just read Imam al-Quduri. He says, وَالنَّجَاسَةُ إِذَا أَصَابَتِ الْمِرْآةِ, right, أو السيف اكتفى بمسحهما اكتفي بمسحهما. Right, if impurity comes in contact with a mirror or a sword, then it is sufficient to merely wipe them, to merely wipe the mirror and wipe the sword. The basis of this is that the Sahaba, in the battles, they would have their swords, right? And they would, if there was blood on the sword, they would wipe it, and then they would pray, and they would have their swords with them while they prayed. Right? So, had the sword not been purified by wiping, they would have prayed without, right, with holding impurities, and that's not, right? They would not have done that, right? So it is considered pure. What is the criteria? Right? He mentions, Imam al-Quduri, he mentions the mirror and the sword. Right? This ruling applies to anything that has a polished type surface, that it doesn't have any visible pores. Right? So, like cloth has pores. If you look very closely, right, you can see that there are spaces in between the threads. It's not a polished surface, but this table, right, is most definitely a polished surface. Right? So this would apply to a lot of different things. So anything that is glass, right, would be of this nature. Right? Anything that is actually polished, right? So some furniture is polished. You have that sealing on it. What's it called? The lacquer or something? And the stain or whatever it's called. Right? Some furniture is quite like these tables here. Right? There's no visible pores, right, that are clear. Right? Tiny bumps and dents. That doesn't exclude it from the ruling. Right? This also applies to any plates, utensils, right? Your wall at home, right? And many different things. So it is purified when one wipes it away. It wipes the impurity away, and no traces remain. Right? So the traces are the color or the smell of that impurity. If you had, for instance, say you accidentally, right, you picked up the wrong package of steaks at the supermarket, right, and you put a wet steak on a plate, and then you realize, astaghfirullah, so you threw it away, right? And now the plate is impure, right? Do you have to use water? Right? You can, if you wipe it and there's no traces on it, then it's considered pure. If you want to wash, that's between you and, right, your stipulations of hygiene, right? But it technically is pure. Right? So, like a mirror or anything, these things happen a lot. Right? The bathroom counter, the bathtub, the toilet seat. Right? The toilet seat would be considered, right, a polished surface. So if you are in a public restroom or something, to merely wipe over it, right, would be sufficient to purify it, as long as there's no traces left. Right? However, if it's dry, nothing dry transfers. Right? So if there's a dry impurity here and I touch it, it's not on my hand. Right? I don't consider that it transferred. So, now, this applies whether the impurity itself is wet, or if it's dry, or if it's solid, or if it's a liquid. It applies to all cases. And so say you spilled something, right, or something impure was on your countertop, your granite countertop, right, and it dried. Right? If you can wipe it such that the traces are gone, then it's sufficient. So, the last is drying, that if it dries up, this applies to the ground, right, to the ground outside. Specifically, right, some scholars have added to it, right, anything that has ittisal qarar, anything that is firmly rooted to the ground, because it's considered as if it's connected to the ground outside. Right? So, but the general ruling applies originally to the earth. So if, right, people had fields, they had crops, they had a lot of different things, and they also had animals walking around. Right? So a person may have bales of hay that they're going to sell, and then the animal urinates on it. Right? Or they have different corn stalks and this and that, and then some animal comes and, right, makes it impure. So these rulings applied then. Right? So the basic ruling is if impurity comes in contact with the ground, so there's impurity on the ground, right, and it dries up either by the sun or by the wind, right, and it dries up, and after it dries up you cannot see any traces of it, that place is pure. You can pray on that place without any doubts. Right? So this applies if a person is praying outside, a person has to pray outside. If the ground is dry and there's no traces of impurity, then you can pray. You don't have to investigate any further. Right? You wouldn't have to investigate at all. If it's dry, you just assume purity. If it's wet, you assume purity as well. But if you smell or you see traces of actual impurity, not just muddy water, right, then then you cannot, right? Right, so if it dries and the traces are gone by drying, then that place is pure. It's pure to pray on, but it's not pure to use for tayammum. So that one specific place you cannot use for tayammum. Right, and this is important for people who have, right, animals, right, sheep, and they have them in their, right, they have stables with horses and these things. Right, if it dries and the traces are gone, it's pure. Same thing if a person has a back patio, right? So like the brick-laid patio outside would take the same ruling because it has a firm rooting to the ground. Now this applies to the ground itself and anything that is firmly rooted to the ground, right? So we mentioned the corn stalks, the trees, the bases of trees and these things, because they're attached to the ground. If they're attached to the ground, they have the same ruling as the ground. Right? The only difference would be that if you actually cut the corn, right? If you cut the corn, now it's not attached anymore, then you have to deal with it differently. Okay? But while it's attached, it has the same ruling as the earth. So. There's one other issue that Imam Quduri doesn't bring up, right? Which is istihala. Istihala is a chemical or an actual transformation, right? That something was one thing and then it changed to another thing, right? And this happened in the earlier generations of Islam, that a donkey died on a salt field, salt mine. Right? And they came back to that place days later and it was completely gone. The entire donkey became salt. Right? So, dead donkey, impure. Right? But there is no more dead donkey. It is not a donkey, it's salt now. Right? So because it's salt, right, you can't say that, okay, this donkey is impure. There is no donkey. Right? So the basis is that it's no longer there. Right? So the impurity is no longer there. Same thing, this applies greatly to a lot of the chemical processes that are used to make foods, to make to certain ingredients, that if a thing has either its essence changed from one thing to another, like the donkey to a salt, or its core qualities have changed, right, then it takes on a new ruling of whatever that new thing is. Right. Now we don't need to get into too many details about ingredients and these things, but a lot of the ingredients do have a type of istihala to them. Obviously caution is there. So you'll find that even that some people are more strict on certain ingredients, some people are less strict on certain ingredients. Generally revolves around things like this. Right, so part of istihala would be like, for instance, if something was impure and you burned it, and now it's just ashes, right? That would be pure. Right? It would still be pure. So this doesn't have too many practical implications today, but it does in the chemical field. Right? So certain ingredients do apply to this. So if people are very lax in their ingredients, then just leave them. Just leave them. It's not a point of objection because of these possibilities. So that's just removing filth in general. Imam Quduri doesn't go into great detail about how to wash away the filth. He just says that you can wash it with regular water or any liquid that can remove it. Right? However, we find in other texts that there's a distinction between visible impurities and impurities that you can't see with the naked eye. Right? And it's considered to be visible if you can still see it after it dried, that you can actually see the essence of that thing, not just its qualities. So a color is not the thing itself. If you can see the thing after it dried, then that is a visible impurity. So visible impurities, the basis is you keep washing until you can't see it anymore, with the exception of things that are stained. So if something is stained and you cannot get it off without difficulty, then you're excused. You're excused. You don't have to use soap. You don't have to use hot water. Many people don't even have, right, access to these things. And the rulings of Islam are for everyone, not just a particular few. Right? So if it's visible, you remove it. Right? If you can do that in one wash, that's sufficient. If it takes 3, that's sufficient. Right? Excluding the stain. Right? So if like blood stains, right, you might not get it out, right, even if you scrub for a while. Right? So as long as you get the essence out, difficult to remove traces are excused. If it's not visible, like urine or alcohol, right, if it dries up, then you might not always see where it was. Right? So the basis is, again, it's still removal. Right? But the scholars, just to make it easy on people, because you can't see it, right, that you wash it 3 times and each time you wring it out. Sufficient. Right? So you have a little bit of, right, so you have a brand new baby and you got a little bit of urine on your sleeve, for instance, right? And then so you take that part of the sleeve and you wash it. You wash it with water, then you wring it out until it stops dripping. You wash it again, you wring it out till it stops dripping. You wash it again, wring it out till it stops dripping. It's pure. Right? No need to second guess or what if it's still there. No, it's gone. So many of the scholars, they've made that distinction of the 3 times just to make it easy for people to know when they're done, know when they can stop. Right? However, the basis is if you wash it, even if it's once, as long as it's, right, if you're reasonably sure that it's gone, then it's gone. Right? And we'll find that a lot of the rulings are based on reasonable surety. It's up to you. How do you feel? Is it still gone? And reasonable surety tends to have some sort of proof to it. It's not just a guess. Okay. Now, if the impurity is on something that cannot be squeezed dry, like a mattress or a sofa, right? You're not going to wash your mattress and then squeeze it dry 3 times, right? Unless you're, right, very buff, right, and strong to do that. Right? So for those things, it's merely a drip dry. Right? You wash it such that it's, right, that you use a healthy amount of water that is dripping wet, right? And then you let it drip dry until it's, or if it's like a sofa, you can pat it dry until, right, it's decently dried out, and then you do it again 2 more times, so 3 times. However, when it comes to removing filth, the first criteria is to diminish it first and then to wash it. Like for instance, if I had impurity, if I had a cup of water, it would be a cool experiment. If there's impurity on this table, right, and I just pour water on it, what's going to happen? It's going to spread everywhere, right? So what like in the case of the couch or the sofa or the mattress, what I would do is dry it first with a towel, right, and then put the water, right? So it's not spreading whatever is there. The same thing on the table. If there's impurity on the table, I will dry it first and then wash the spots, right? Or just wipe it with something, right, because this is smooth. So, any questions on that before we go to the types? I just want to, so if you think of anything, just jump in.
For when there's an impurity that reaches the ground,
Yeah.
dried by the sun, is there a certain amount of time that it takes for it to become purifying again?
The tayammum? No. That's a good question. If you washed it, it would be pure again. Right, like we see in the sunnah, the man urinated in the masjid, right? And the Prophet ﷺ, he said just pour water on it, right? Because that will purify it, and then, right? But you wouldn't be able to use for tayammum unless it rained or something like that, because, right, that place would still remain impure until that impurity was actually removed. Right? That's a good question, though. So basically, there are 2 types of filth. Right? There is najasa al-mughallada or najasa al-ghalidha, right? Heavy filth, right? now we get caught up in terminology, right? Heavy filth is definitely not a weight, right? And it's not like something that's large in quantity, or it's not something like that, right? Heavy filth is that which is unanimously considered filth. Right? Whatever is agreed upon as filth, right, within the school, right, especially if it's with inter-school agreements, right, that is considered heavy filth. Right? So there is no difference of opinion whether urine is filth, or stool, or blood, or pus, or anything, right? Or alcohol itself, wine itself. Right? Or unslaughtered meat, or the hide that has not been tanned, right, of an unslaughtered animal. Right? Those things, there's no doubt, there's no difference of opinion regarding. They are major filth. They are heavy filth, ghalidha. So here's a few examples that are there. Right? The third one, he says everything that invalidates the wudu when exiting. Right? Who can remember from the early chapters what invalidates the wudu by exiting? Just list them off. Anyone? What invalidates the wudu by exiting?
So what comes from the two passages?
Good. Anything that comes from the two passages, right? There is one exclusion, which is the child. Right? If a child, right, the child is not impure. Don't go wash your child 3 times and squeeze them dry. Right. Right.
And then anything impure that comes otherwise, and that leaves its exit.
It leaves its exiting point and it flows. Right. So any impurity that comes out other than the 2 passageways, right, and flows to a different part, that breaks the wudu. Right. So that would be flowing blood. So flowing blood is a major heavy filth. However, if you have a tiny bit of blood that just comes out and stays in its place, right, and then that touches your sleeve or that touches something else, that is not impure. That is not impure. Right? Now, some scholars, they said that is a point of caution, and caution in general is recommended. It's not obligatory, but it is recommended. You will be rewarded for taking on basic level caution that is coupled with knowledge, that if that tiny bit of blood were to enter into a small amount of water, the water will be considered impure. So that's a stricter opinion. It is not the relied upon position, but it is a point of caution that you can take that if you want to be extra cautious. So if you have a tiny bit of blood and you put your hand into a bucket of water, you can consider that bucket of water pure according to the relied upon position, or you can be cautious and just dump it out and put new water. Because technically it does not break your wudu, therefore it's not impure. It does not break wudu, therefore it is not impure. What else doesn't break your wudu? Right? Vomit that's less than a mouthful. Right? So for instance, if your child, after feeding, they vomit, right? It's just a tiny bit, you can consider it pure. It's pure. Right? And you can reasonable surety, was that a mouthful or not? Like, you can't ask them particularly. Right? So, right, blood that's not flowing would not be impure.
For the child or for the adult?
The child. The child's mouth.
Why would that be invalidating to you? It's not coming out.
No, it's not invalidating to you, but it's still, the thing is impure, because had it come out from you, it would have been, right? So like, if blood flows from my hand and then touches someone else's hand, their hand is impure. Right? Yeah, so it's not just about me. Right? The object is impure if it fulfilled the condition that it came out and it flowed. Right? So that.
But would it, if it happens to me, would it invalidate my wudu?
Yeah.
If it happens to someone else and it touches me, would it invalidate my wudu, or do I just have to?
No. Nothing external could invalidate your wudu. Right. So if, like, for instance, the child urinates and that it gets on the parent's wudu is intact. They just have to remove that thing. And children don't technically make wudu for all the salats, right, at that age. Right, so alcohol here is wine. Right, wine is unanimously understood to be impure, khamr. Right, Rijsun min amri shaytani fajtanibuhu. It is an impurity from the actions of shaitan, so stay away from it. The clear text of the Quran. However, non-wine alcohol, so alcohol made from potatoes or from rice, right, rice wine, or what else is from dates or from, right, so anything that is not from grapes, dates, or raisins. Grapes, dates, or raisins are considered wine. Right? That is the alcohol that is unanimously understood as impure. Right? If it comes from other sources like rice or potatoes or barley or hops or whatever it may be, right, then it is not considered wine. However, right, it is considered non-wine alcohol. Now there is a clear difference of opinion between the Imam Abu Hanifa and his students about non-wine alcohol or any liquid intoxicating substance, and any intoxicating drink. Right, so the Imam, he said that it's pure. So any alcohol that is non-wine, that is not from grapes, dates, or raisins, is considered pure. However, ingesting it is impermissible, right, if it is used to the extent that it intoxicates, or it's used with the intention of intoxication, or it's used in the same way that regular intoxicants would be used, or it's used in vain. Right? If any product, like any food product or any cooking or anything involves a non-wine alcohol, right, then we would see these criteria. Is the amount added into the product enough to make someone intoxicated? Right? If yes, then it's not permissible. Right? If it's, is it used with the intention to intoxicate? So you have, like, for instance, like a rum cake and eggnog, and these things are generally used with a certain intention behind it, either actual or effective. Right? Is it used in vain? Right? So, like, a great example is donuts, for instance. Some donuts, they use a type of alcohol, which is non-wine, a type of alcohol, to produce the actual donut itself. Right? So there is a reason for it. It's not just in vain. It's not just, hey, let's just add some alcohol for no reason. Right? No, there is a reason, because it's used to make the compound, right, that the actual donut needs. But there are also donuts that have a flavoring of alcohol, like rum flavored donuts. And there's a famous place in New York, I won't mention the name because there's also one here, right, that has one, right, all of their donuts are fine, right, because of this ruling, even though they use alcohol to make the donuts, right, except for the rum flavored donut, because that addition of using the alcohol for the flavoring is in vain. There's no need for it. Right? It's not a necessity, right? And generally, to advertise something as rum flavored, people buy it for that reason. Right? So it's used in a manner that one would use rum. Right? So if there are products that have alcohol in it, right, that are non-wine alcohol, like soy sauces, vanilla extract, right? I was just researching an answer. They mentioned that some vanilla extract has large quantities of non-wine alcohol, and that many high school students were caught buying it from the grocery store and mixing it with their coffee to get intoxicated. That you could actually use enough to get intoxicated. Right? Don't get any. Yeah. So, right, some essential oils. There's a lot of different products that may use it. It's if one wants to take a cautious route, it is rewarding. Right? However, the opinion is here. The Imam said it's pure and it's permissible to ingest with these conditions. But yeah, outwardly it will be considered pure. His students, they disagreed and they said that it's impure. However, we mentioned before that heavy filth is that which is unanimously agreed to be filth, So the fact that there's a difference of opinion, that even if we were to assume that it's filth, it would be light filth. Right? But that is not the relied upon position, but that is a position you can take if you want to be cautious. Right? So the use of certain perfumes that have alcohol would be permissible. Right? It would be considered pure according to the Imam. Right? Hand sanitizers that have alcohol would be considered pure. Right? So we can take the opinion of the Imam, especially if there's a need, or there would be undue hardship involved in not using it or in removing it every single time, or the fact that it's just now widespread and common. Because of those three considerations, we can use the opinion of the Imam, right, and consider it pure. Right? And that's a valid opinion, looking at the different proofs involved that he did. Right? So some types of heavy filth that are not mentioned on the slide here, right, are the urine of non-halal animals. So if anyone deals with animals, this would be important to them. Right? Non-halal animals, right? So like for instance, the urine of a dog would be a heavy filth because you can't eat a dog, right? Right? The stool of a dog or the stool of any predatory animal, right, would also be heavy filth. The saliva of both of those, the saliva of the dog and the saliva of any predatory animal, is considered a heavy filth. So the dog's saliva is what's impure. Right? Touching a dry dog or a dry dog walking up next to you does not make you impure. Right? Even if they were wet, it would not make you impure. It's their saliva that is impure. And then also the stool of chicken, ducks, or geese. They are impure. They are heavy filth. It's agreed upon that they are heavy filth. Okay, so if you're walking, a friend of mine, he went to Egypt, and a bird targeted the top of his head, right, after its daily lunch. Right? So my friend was telling me about this. So my first question was, what kind of bird was it? Right? Because it's important. What kind of bird? Because is it heavy filth or is it light filth? Right? And they have different rulings. So he said I didn't get a chance to ask it. So he was kind of upset. Allah bless him. Mashallah. Right, so light filth, right, are those impurities where there's either contradicting texts, that one text would seem to indicate that it's pure, right, and one text would seem to indicate that it's not. Right, so instead of making some final decision, they just left it. Right, that it's light. It's light impurity. Right. So that was the Imam's position. Right, so only a few things would fall under this. Right, because only a few things that there's a little ambiguity regarding the texts. Right, so the urine of horses, right, the Prophet ﷺ said that you can pray on the top of he instructed that you can pray on your horse even if the horse has urine on their legs, right, so technically you're attached to it while praying, right, so that would indicate that it's pure, right, but other texts would indicate otherwise, so they left it. Right? It's light impurity, has a lesser ruling. Right? Had it been so certain, then there would have been certain texts. The urine of halal animals that you can eat, so cow urine, right, sheep urine, goat urine would all be light filth, and the droppings of non-halal birds. Right, so like a falcon, right, there was a falcon outside of Seekers the other day. It caught a rabbit. Somebody took pictures. A really beautiful bird. Right. Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi al-Balkhi, he said that the saints and the righteous Muslims, that their souls are like the falcons of the king. That they go and come, but they always come back to the king. And they go and do things, and then they come back to the king. Right. May Allah make our souls like that. Tamam. Right, so those are the types. So there's heavy filth, and then there's light filth. Now, when we say that it is obligatory to remove impurities from the body, from the clothing, and from the place of prayer, right, there is a small amount that is excused, right, because removing 100% of impurity from the body, from the clothes, and from the prayer may be undue hardship. Right, so there's a level that is excused insofar as the prayer is still valid. Right, however, we'll talk about the rulings involved. Right, so if it's heavy filth, right, if the size or the weight of a dirham remains on the body, right, or less, then it is excused. The prayer is still valid. Right, why did they mention size or weight? If it's a solid object, right, then it'll be the weight of a dirham. If it's a liquid object, then it'll be, right, the diameter of the spot affected. Right, so a dirham approximates to 5 grams in weight, right, and 5 centimeters in diameter. Some of the scholars, they mentioned that if you want to know if something is 5 centimeters in diameter, just take some water in your hand, right, in the palm of your hand, and then straighten your palm. The amount of water you would find that there's a little hollow spot in the hand, right, that's approximately the amounts that's excused. So if you have, like for instance, what were the types that we just mentioned just now? If you have like a cow or something, or a sheep, and a drop of its urine got on your shirt, and it's just a tiny bit, it's excused. If it's, that's heavy filth. If you have a child and there's urine on your, okay, if it's that little, the prayer is still valid. The prayer is still valid. If it's bigger than that, then you have to remove it in order to pray. If it's light filth, what we just mentioned, then it will be 1/4 of the entire body or 1/4 of the entire garment. Right, so if it's 1/4 or less, if it's less than 1/4, then the prayer is still valid. If it's more than 1/4, then the prayer is invalid, if it's prayed with that on a person. Right, so for heavy filth, if it's less than a dirham, it's smaller, less than 5 grams or less than 5 centimeters, then it's excused and it's recommended to remove, regardless if the prayer is going to be valid or not. Right, so even though the prayer is going to be valid, it's still recommended to remove. If it's more than a dirham, it's obligatory to remove, because the prayer will not count if one prays with that on them. Right? And in the highly unlikelihood that you could exactly know it to be exactly the dirham size, exactly 5 grams or exactly 5 centimeters, no more, no less, right, then some said it's still necessary to remove and that it's sinful to leave, right, but the most sound position is that it's not, because the whole point of it being excused is that you're excused. But that's highly unlikely. You just wash it. Right? If you live in a place with less water, then you can remember these. Just regards to urine, quickly, the Prophet ﷺ said, "Istanzihu min al-bawl fa inna 'amata 'adhab al-qabri minhu." That be careful of urine, because majority of those punished in the graves are because of it. Right? Meaning that they were not conscious of the urine, right? Therefore they prayed and their prayers were not valid, right? Because of large amounts of urine, right? And 5 centimeters is not that big, right? So however, right, so there's a reason why sitting is a sunnah, right? Because in sitting there is many wisdoms. One of them is that it's easier to stay away from the urine, right? From the urine splashing back, or from the spread of najasa, of impurities. However, the spray, right, if there's spray of urine that comes back on one's clothes, it's excused, even if it's a lot. Right? But splashes of urine are not excused. Right? So if there's a splash, that must be washed. Right? If it's a spray that just bounces back, that would be unduly difficult to stay away from all spray. Right? It would be hard. You can try to minimize as possible, as much as possible, but it is excused even if it ends up being a lot. There's a few other issues that are not mentioned here. One of them is that the natural wetness of the female private part is pure. It is not impure whatsoever. Regular wind also, like passing wind, right? Even though it is one of the things that goes through the two passageways and breaks the wudu, it is not impure in and of itself. It is not impure in and of itself because it's only impure because it passes by impurities. Right? That's why it breaks the wudu, right? But it itself is pure. Imam al-Quduri doesn't go into the matter of istinja. Istinja is to wash oneself after using the restroom. So we'll just mention a few quick details about it, just to the itmam lil-fa'ida, just to complete the benefit of this chapter. Istinja, right, is considered sunnah and emphasized sunnah. Right, but the definition of istinja must be understood in order to really understand it. Right, so if a person if a person relieves themselves and the impurity does not go beyond the exit point, right, it stays within the area of the exit point and it doesn't spread to other places, in that case it is sunnah to wash it, right, to wipe and wash with water. That's where istinja applies. If it goes beyond the exit point, right, slightly, but less than the amount of a dirham, right, then it is considered removal of najasa. It's not considered istinja anymore. It's beyond that. It's a bigger level. Right, so the same criteria would apply, that if it's less than a dirham, it would be recommended to remove. Right? If it's more than a dirham, it's obligatory to remove. Right? So one should not be confused that, okay, istinja is sunnah only, so I can just leave it. No, if the filth passes or moves past the exit points, it's no longer a discussion of istinja or not. It's removal of impurities, because istinja only applies to the actual place of exit, the place of exit itself. So that portion of the body, because especially at a time when water was scarce, that portion of the body has a very a more relaxed ruling. Right. So many of the people in the of the Sahaba, they would suffice with only wiping, and they would use rocks at that time. Today we have paper. So if a person relieved themselves and it didn't spread past the exit point, and they use it to wipe, right? The wiping does not remove impurity. Wiping only diminishes. Right? It only diminishes it. It lessens it. Right? So if that person were to sit into a small amount of water, right, it would make the water impure. Right? However, Imam Shurun Baladi, he mentions that if a person were only wiped and they didn't use water, right, so there's a lessening of impurity, but it's still there. Right? And then they sweat, right, and the sweat and their clothing gets wet, right, then it's excused, because there would be undue difficulty in that, regarding that. Right? It's excused. Right? However, there is great merit in using water, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala praised the people of Quba because they combined with wiping and washing. Right? So the order of preference is that a person wipes, then washes. Right? So again, the same principle of reducing and then removing. Same thing if it was on your table, there's impurity on the table, you wipe it first and then you wash it, so not to spread the impurity. The second best would be to just wash. The second best would be to just wash. The third best would be to just wipe. Okay, and the sunnah is to use your left hand when cleaning oneself, and to and to use an odd number of times, even if 2 is sufficient, to add a third one because of the sunnah. Right? Or if 3 is not enough, then to go to 5 because that's the next odd number. Right? So that concludes the section on purification. It's an important section, but one thing that is very important not to fall into is waswasa, right? Misgivings and doubts. The basis of all of the rulings of purification is reasonable surety, right? And has nothing to do with what ifs and conjecture, right? What if it's still impure? What if I didn't wash it all? Right? That has nothing to do with it. Right? We don't act on anything less than reasonable surety. If you're reasonably sure there's still impurity, continue to wash. If you're not reasonably sure, right, then just leave it. It's better to just abandon that thought and to act contrary to the thoughts. And this happens a lot with people assuming that they broke their wudu. Right? People they feel maybe they passed wind or maybe they didn't, right? If it's a maybe, just pray, Allahu Akbar, right? And consider yourself drawing near to Allah by just saying Allahu Akbar. Ignore the field. You get rewarded for disobeying your waswasa, right? And shaitan, right? If you're reasonably sure, then act upon it, right? It's a slight tangent, but I want anyone here ever go fishing in the ocean, just from the shore though, like not in the water, like standing on the beach and fishing from there? Yeah, so I went with a friend of mine, first time ever. We ended up praying Fajr on the beach. It was quite nice. And because of the waves, right, you throw the line out and you dig the pole into the ground somehow, right? And because of the waves, the thing would constantly go like this. So I told my friend, is that a bite? No. He's like, no. Is that a bite? No. Is that a fish? He's like, no. It's like, then he just told me, he's like, you will know. Right? You will know when it happens. Right? So, right? And when the fish actually came, it went like that. Right? It was not even a question. Right? So similarly, right? If you broke your wudu, you would know. Right? It's not a mystery. Right? If you broke it, you would know. If you have any doubts, you didn't break it. You did not break it. You will know. Right? So the basis is you act on certainty. You act on certainty. Right? You act on certainty or reasonable surety, which stands in the place of certainty when certainty is not possible. Right? And in the end of the day, right, there are some times where, right, things may happen and you're excused, and Allah will still accept. Like for instance, if you had impurity on you and you had no idea it was there, it came from somewhere else, and right, you never knew. Right? On the Day of Judgment, you think that prayer will be rejected, even though you took all the measures that you had possible, right? But you had more than a dirham of something somewhere on your body that you had no clue was there. Right? Technically, fiqh would say it's not valid. Right? But things with Allah are not so dry. They're not so black and white. Right? We try our best, remove what we can, we act on knowledge, we act on reasonable surety or certainty, and we leave the rest to Allah. And anything beyond that will be undue difficulty, and that is not part of our religion, nor is it what Allah wants from us. So, and the reason why we're giving so much importance to this is because hundreds of people daily are harmed by waswasa. Right? People who make wudu 5, 6, 7 times in a row because maybe one hair wasn't washed or one part was dry. People who make their ghusl constantly over and over again just because they may have touched something that touched something that touched something that was impure. You know? And it sounds, right, it really, it's sad. But these are the actions of shaitan, and how many people have left the prayer because of it. So after discussing the that which is a means to the prayer, right, the Imam brings the prayer next. Right, so in reality, prayer is right, that the chapters of fiqh, of worships, discuss the arkan of Islam. Salat, Sawm, Zakat, and Hajj. Those are the main 4 chapters. And purification is a subset of the prayer because it's a condition of the prayer. That's why it's discussed. Right? Even though purification has its own virtues and should not only be seen as a means to the prayer. Right? It is a worship in and of itself. Right? But it is not the all-out purpose. Right? The salat is the purpose. Right? So salat by itself, as-salah in Arabic, means dua. And we see it used in the Quran many different places with the meaning of dua. Right? So Allah says to the Prophet, وَصَلِّ عَلَيْهِمْ, right? And pray for them. Right? And using the word salat, we see that إِنَّ اللَّهَ وَمَلَائِكَتُهُ يُصَلُّونَ عَلَى النَّبِي, that Allah and His Messenger are يُصَلُّونَ عَلَى, are sending prayers upon the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Right? So a prayer from Allah, a salat from Allah to the creation, is considered a dua of mercy or a giving of mercy, a showing of mercy. A salah from the angels, right, to the creation, right, is considered a dua of forgiveness. Right? So the prayer of the angels, right, for the people is forgiveness for them. وَيَسْتَغْفِرُونَ لِمَنْ فِي الْأَرْضِ, that they seek forgiveness for those in the land. Right? And for us, it's considered the prayer. Right? The prayer. Right? But the legal definition, right? They usually use quite vague terminology, that it's a specific types of actions done with a specific intention, right? With specific conditions and integrals. Right? And the reason why they're vague like that, because a proper definition should include everything that thing is and exclude any extras. Right? So it's hard to do that. Some people said that the prayer is recitation and standing and bowing and sajda. Okay, what if you're sick and you can't prostrate? So that you're excluded from that. What if you're mute and you can't speak? So what about recitation? Okay, you're excused. So it becomes hard to define. Right? But there's no point in getting caught up in definitions. It's not the point. But it's interesting to see these, how in depth the Arabic goes. Right, now, the commandment of prayer in the Quran is not just addus salah. It's aqimus salah. It means to establish the prayer. Right, Allah doesn't say sallu. Right, Allah says aqimus salah, establish the prayer. Right, so Imam Abdullah bin Alawi al-Haddad, alayhi rahmatullahi ta'ala, he says that the prayer has an outward form and an inward reality. And one is not considered of those who establish the prayer in the sight of Allah until they establish its form and its reality as is befitting of the prayer. Right? Fiqh, right, Islamic law, only discusses the outward form. There may be indications toward an intention and other things like that. Right? However, it is not the responsibility of Islamic law to discuss the inward realities of the prayer. Right? That is found, right, in the books of spirituality and the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, right, and the meanings that are found in the Quran related to salat. For instance, Allah says, وَأَقِيمُ الصَّلَاةَ لِذِكْرِ, and establish the prayer for my remembrance. Right? And it is the establishment of the prayer that guarantees a person all of the virtues of the salat. Right? All of the virtues in the hadith that come, right, about the rewards a person gets for praying, or the transformative nature of the prayer, as Allah says, "Inna salata tanha anil fahsha'i wal munkar," that the prayer prevents one from shameful acts and sins. So a person may pray, why was it not helping me for my sins? Right? Have you established the prayer, or did you just pray it? Did you just finish it? Right. So the definition of establishing, right, is al-muhafadhatu alayha fi awqatiha ma'a istifa'i shurutiha wa arkaniha zahiran wa batinan. Sorry. Apologies. There's like a timer on here. Right, so it means to preserve right? To persevere in it. Sorry, there's a typo. To persevere in the prayer. So to have steadfastness in the prayer is part of it. Not just to do it once in a while, but to continuously do the prayer, right? Fi awqatiha, in its appropriate times. Right? And part of the chapters to come is the timings of the prayer, right? Because there are some timings of the prayer that you have to pray, but it's sinful, right? The fact that you delayed it to this time is sinful, right? So, and a prayer is supposed to be a means of drawing nearer to Allah, and if a person delays it to that time, they're not drawing near, they're disobeying. Right? So in its proper times, right, while fulfilling its conditions. So we started talking about a few of the conditions of the prayer. Right? We talked about the covering of the nakedness, we talked about purification, we talked about removing impurities and so forth. Right? Wa arkaniha, and its integrals, which are coming in the next chapter. Outwardly, so that's what fiqh talks about, right? And inwardly, and that's what spirituality talks about. All right, some fiqh books have combined both, and it's really beautiful to see, right? Because the Prophet said, "Sallu kama ra'aytumuni usalli," pray as though you've seen me pray, right? And that includes the outward and the inward. So, the Prophet ﷺ is narrated, has said, and Imam Ahmad brings this hadith. He said that man hafadha ala salawati al-khams, whoever holds fast to the 5 prayers, ala wudu'iha wa mawaqitiha wa ruku'iha wa sujudiha wa ya'tarifu annaha haqqun lillahi ta'ala alayhi kana jasaduhu haraman ala an-nar. Whoever holds fast to the 5 prayers, its wudu, its times, its bowing, its prostration, and knows that this is a right of Allah Most High upon them, right? Their body is prohibited for the hellfire. Their body is prohibited to enter the hellfire. Right, so you have the outward, you have the perfection of the wudu, the proper bowing, the proper prostration, but also this sense that Allah deserves this. So there's an inward reality. Right, the person is haram on the fire. Right, they will not enter the fire. Yeah. So in the next, all throughout the upcoming chapters, we will discuss the outward form of the prayer, right, which has a great importance and a great reality. Right? There's 2 extremes. Those who are only concerned with outward forms and they forget about the inward realities of these worships. And then there's those who care only about the inward realities and they don't act on the outward forms. Both of them are equally important. Obviously, the heart is the most important, right? But one cannot claim to have a heart with Allah and then belittle his rulings. Imam al-Junayd said, if a person came to you flying in the air, right, but they don't follow the Sharia, don't take from them. If they don't follow the rule, the law, the guidance, the limits of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, don't take from them. Right? It's istidraj. Right, so Imam al-Haddad, he says that the reality of the prayer, right, he gives 6 things. And we'll close with this, and then we'll start in the actual chapter of the prayer in the next class, inshallah. So he says the reality of the prayer is 1, al-hudur ma'allah, presence with Allah. Right, so that the heart is present with Allah. The opposite of this is heedlessness. Right, is heedlessness. And Imam al-Haddad later in another place he says, right, man khallat ibadatu anil hudur فَعِبَادَتُهُ هَبَاءٌ مَنْثُورٌ. Whoever's worship is bereft of presence, then their worship is dust in the wind. It's scattered dust. وَقَدِمْنَا إِلَى مَا عَمِلُوا مِنْ عَمَلٍ فَجَعَلْنَاهُ هَبَاءً مَنْثُورًا. And we approached what they did of actions and we made it, right, dust, right, scattered dust, right, dust in the wind, worthless. Right. The second is that one does the prayer ikhlasun lillahi wal qasdu lillah, right, with sincere aims and intentions for Allah. That is not done for anyone other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right. And there's a really beautiful section on this in the 40 Principles of the Religion by Imam al-Ghazali, where he talks about that if one's only purpose for initiating the prayer was other than Allah, then it is complete riya, it is showing off, and it's not accepted whatsoever. Right? But if a quality of the prayer is beautified or lengthened because of someone else, then the root action is accepted, but the qualities will diminish to the extent that other than Allah is associated, then the rewards are diminished. The third is to iqbar ala Allahi bi kunhi himmatihi, is to turn 100% to Allah, right, with one's heart. And so to fully turn to Allah with one's heart. Aqbil wa la takhaf, right? Usjud waqtarib, right? Prostrate and draw nearer. Prostrate and draw nearer. Right? For those who can, make the prostration of recitation. Apologies. That is a verse of sajda. The third is to completely focus on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with one's heart in the prayer, or to completely focus in the prayer. Right? There's different ways. The highest level would be to focus on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself. Right? But focusing on the prayer itself is also important. Right? And that's why he says that number 5, one's thoughts are strictly on the prayer. So you can be thinking of the realities of the ruku', the reverence in front of Allah, the realities of sajda, humility in front of Allah, right? The realities of recitation that you're reciting to Allah, right? The remembrances that you're saying. What are the meanings of the tashahhud in the salawat? Right? And then the last is to uphold the etiquettes of communion with Allah. Right? There are etiquettes that are mentioned in the fiqh. Right? So there's kind of an overlap on this one, because part of the etiquettes is how you approach the prayer outwardly and how you approach the prayer inwardly. There's etiquettes. So what type of clothes you wear when you pray, there's an etiquette, right? Right? Brushing the teeth is an etiquette of the prayer. And they say that anything that you would do in order to ready yourself to be in the presence of a respected person, you should do that and more to ready yourself to be in the presence of Allah. Right? The Prophet ﷺ, he said, "Innal musalliya munajin rabbah." Verily, the one praying is in communion with his Lord. Is in communion with his Lord. It's a private discussion, a najwa, right? A private conversation. And the realities of prayer are endless. Right? The Prophet said, "As-salatu mi'rajul mu'min." The prayer is the ascension of the believer. It's the point where the body is engaged in motions, but the heart is free to fly. Right? The soul is like the falcon returning to the king. And the metaphor of the falcon is beautiful, because if you see a falcon on the earth, it looks very awkward, like it doesn't belong. Right? And that's how the believer should be in the dunya. So, you ever seen a bird walk on his feet? It's quite awkward, right? You can tell that it's not where there's. It's like they're saying, "Don't look at me. I'm not supposed to be here." Right? Right? And that reality is how the believer is in this in the dunya. We're in the dunya, we're moving around, but we know for a fact that this is not home. This is not where we belong. Right? Our souls are constantly desiring to transcend and to fly, and to ascend into the great heavens above. Right? Back to the owner, back to the king. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us that prayer which will draw us nearer to Him, and to purify our hearts, and to give us that prayer that will remove the veils from our hearts, and to allow us to enter into His divine presence with great etiquette as slaves, desperate and not deserving. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this blessed month to make us of those who follow the Prophet ﷺ outwardly and inwardly, in speech and in action and in character, until we meet him on the sirat. Wa sallallahu ta'ala ala sayyidina Muhammad wa sallam. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. If there are any questions, and we have a bit of time, we can take some questions. I believe the second class will be cancelled for this week. Any questions? Who is the person who defined? Yeah, that's a great question. I had to do research on this a long time ago, so I gathered everything in one place, but I didn't gather which book I got it from. It's either Habib Hassan al-Bahri al-Jifri, because he has a book called Sifat al-Salat al-Muqarrabin, the description of the prayers of those brought near to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or Imam al-Ghazali, okay, or Imam al-Haddad. And for some reason, since I said Imam al-Haddad, my heart is reasonably sure that it's him. Right? And we act on reasonable surety when certainty is not possible. So it might be in the Book of Assistance. Actually, I could probably tell you right now. Any other questions? I have to find it somewhere else. Any questions?
Were you wanted to buy or purchase the text? Can you give us the text name, please?
For this class, or yeah, it's called Mukhtasar al-Quduri. If I can go back. The title is there, Mukhtasar al-Quduri. I believe there are a couple attempts at translating it. There is one very large blue, dark blue, kind of this thick translation of it. Those who are well acquainted with good translations would not prefer it over other translations, but it's there. It has the Arabic and the English in it. It has both. I don't know if there's any other translations besides that one. Are there? Yeah. There's two others, apparently. They're not necessarily any better. So, translating fiqh is very difficult. In the way that the sentence structures are, it's really just tedious work to do it. You almost have to rewrite your own thing. Just understand it and then write it in your own words, but then it's not a translation. So, back to square one. What a paradox to be in. So, any last questions before we close? Yeah.
So you mentioned the ijma' is one of the conditions for a najis to be mughallal.
Mm-hmm.
So is it sufficient to have ijma' within the madhab, or is it the ijma'
Yes.
like
Yeah.
the formula?
Good. Right. So that which is considered heavy filth is that which there's consensus within the madhab, right? If there's consensus throughout all of the madhabs, then it's definitely heavy filth, without a doubt. But there's only a few things that would be that there's a difference on in general, let alone between different madhabs. One of them, famous difference of opinion, would be that Imam Shafi believes the semen to be pure. Right, so that does not affect. Right, there's a consensus amongst the Hanafi scholars that it's not, that it's filth. So it's heavy filth. Whereas the Shafi madhab is quite strict with non-wine alcohol as well. Right, so there's some overlap, but the amount of details that there's actual valid difference of opinion or any significant difference of opinion are very little. Very little. Right? Like almost, if you were to lay out all the rulings that are unanimous, that are agreed upon between all of the madhabs, right, and those that are different, you would find it would be exponentially greater amounts and a very insignificant amount that are different about. And the consequences of those that are different about are generally not that big. It's not like, okay, this person says it's fard and this person says it's haram. Right? It's not that level. Right? It's disliked or haram or wajib or fard. Right? You'll see small difference. Right? Right? So anybody who says that like the difference of opinion is a sign of the illegitimacy of the law, it's blind understanding. Actually, it just shows the depth of the sacred tradition. Right? And those differences of opinion are mercy. Imagine if everything was just one way and you had no permission to do anything else. It would be devastating. Right? Especially in COVID, you have to every store you go in, they try to give you hand sanitizer. Right? If you are forced to take that opinion, right, you'd be dodging people, or you'd just be a hermit at home, or you can be smart, and bring your own. But there's a reason why there's differences. There's a reason why there's concessions. And even the Prophet gave different rulings to different people due to their circumstances. Right? Tamam. So we'll stop here, inshallah. I believe Shaykh Faraz is a bit unwell, so everyone make dua for him. Inshallah, Allah give him shifa and afiyah and a speedy recovery. وصلى الله تعالى على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. الحمد لله.